So I'm Jeremy Grant. As Brian said, I'm the coordinator of the Better Identity Coalition. Most of what makes me an expert in this space is I was in charge of something once that I screwed up in identity. And so I've learned a few things along the way. I'm a managing director up the road in Venables privacy and cybersecurity practice. We're a law firm, but I'm not a lawyer. That's a whole other discussion we can hit over lunch or whiskey. I've done a couple stints in government and spent a lot of time in industry as well. I started as a Senate staffer in the late 90s, got into this space because my boss was what I would call the legislative godfather of smart cards and PKI in government, and I did a lot of work then that fused those technologies together for government use with the Common Access Card, with the PIV card, with NIST doing standards that the civilian sector could use. I also had a second stint leading the Obama administration's NSTIC initiative, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, and in that role I was dual-hatted up at NIST, leading their digital identity research and standards team. In the private sector, I spent about 5 years in the tech side actually building a lot of early digital ID solutions. I spent a few years at an investment bank as a market analyst covering companies in the space. In the last 7 years, I've been doing a whole mishmash of stuff really as a consultant. So I've seen a few things along the way. Setting the stage, what do we mean by identity? It's a term that gets thrown around a lot and kind of gets misused a lot. So this is a really oversimplified approach because there's a whole bunch of other nuances and other applications. But generally when people are talking about identity, they're either talking about identity proofing or they're talking about authentication. So identity proofing is the process you go through when you're opening an account for the first time. And somebody needs to know, hey, I'm Jane Smith. Does a Jane Smith really exist? Because synthetic identity fraud is a huge problem. In fact, the Federal Reserve has said it is the fastest growing type of financial crime. Then if your name's Jane Smith, well, there might be 37,000 of you in the US. Which one are you? Identity resolution becomes really important. And then finally, if I know that you're a real carbon-based life form and you're claiming to be this particular person, how do I know you're really you? Because the model these days has been if I know a few things about you, I might just pass as you, which hasn't really worked well. And a lot of what I think people are talking about in this room with Web3 identity is really focused on solving the identity proofing problem. But there's also authentication where a whole bunch of bad things happen. It's essentially, I have an account, I'm logging back in, it's the password problem. Are you the same person who was previously issued a credential? And as Carol pointed out in her speech earlier, we kind of know how to solve that now. I mean, with things like what's happening in FIDO Alliance and the standards there, we're really on the cusp of true passwordless authentication. I just literally blew up my password last week at PayPal, who's now embraced FIDO passkeys so that I can just log in passwordless on any device. We're getting pretty good there, but the identity proofing side is getting a lot harder. And we're talking a lot today about personal data ownership and how people are going to have more control over things. But we've got a few other challenges besides just empowering people to own their data. So year after year, identity-related cybercrime has been soaring. So you can see, identity scams, are making 2021 a record year. This thing on the right is from something from the Pandemic Accountability Relief Council, the the PRAC. Pandemic Relief, yeah, I get acronyms wrong all the time. It's the government's Council of Inspector Generals that's looking at the billions and billions of dollars that happened during the pandemic with all the benefits fraud. There was a 3,000% increase, according to the Federal Trade Commission, in identity theft reports tied to public benefits. Not exactly surprising, given that there were hundreds of billions of dollars that were made available, and organized crime just swept right in and basically hoovered up more money than the Department of Homeland Security spends on their budget every year. And we're now at a point where ID theft has impacted more than half of American consumers. So, framing the challenge. So this is a very old cartoon that, unfortunately becomes more relevant than ever these days. So what people don't realize, this cartoon is now 29 years old. It was published in 1993, which means these dogs are now a blessed memory because dog years, and their kids probably are too. But the problem is with us more than ever today. And in fact, I'd argue, having been a college freshman when the cartoon was first published, I guess I just finished my freshman year, I experienced things like this, but it was more fun. It was you're not sure on that bulletin board that you're dialing into who's, really who, but it wasn't particularly malicious. It wasn't, particularly sinister. Now dogs on the internet are being weaponized against us to the point, from the previous slide, it's an anomaly these days when a big breach happens and identity doesn't provide the attack vector. But solving this isn't just about security. It's also about how do you do it in a way that enhances privacy, or at least protects it, doesn't make things worse, delivers good customer experiences, because, if we're building things that are so convoluted to use, and I'll say one of the challenges in the Web3 world has been, oh yeah, you'll manage a bunch of cryptographic keys, one for every attribute you're trying to prove. Yeah, who's going to actually do that? In this room we might. I'm an identity geek. That actually sounds cool. But we need to build for the other 99%. compliance. There's plenty of regulations and laws that are out there everybody needs to align with. How do we do this in a way that's actually cost efficient and can lower transaction costs? So much of what we're really trying to do here is build identity systems that we can trust. And on the internet, everybody knows trust has been hard to get right. But identity, when done right, helps to enable trust. Identity becomes the great enabler that delivers a foundation for digital transactions and online experiences that are more secure, that are easier to use, and that can protect privacy better than what we have today, if we get it right. The challenge, as my old colleagues at NIST said in the preamble to their 2017 version of the NIST Digital Identity Guidelines, is that there's a real technical problem here. The process always involves trying to proof individuals over an open network. It always involves authenticating individuals over an open network. And all of the processes and technologies that we use to establish and use digital identity provide a lot of different ways for adversaries to impersonate you or launch other attacks. Now, our approach to date hasn't really been that sophisticated, though for those of you who might have acquired a pandemic puppy over the last couple of years, that name that you chose is probably going to take on big meaning for you or your kids over time. And, it's been really practical when we rely on these things like security questions, because sometimes you're not sure, or you forget, or you change your mind, and then you're thrown into the gorge of eternal peril, also known as the account recovery processes that most organizations use when you just don't know your login information. It's also really been a challenge when we're asking questions where adversaries already know the answer. So, what are the 4 last digits of your SSN? Well, there was a time when Social Security numbers might have been plausibly secret. But today, if my bank asks me that, the only logical answer is, don't you realize the Russians have that, the Chinese have that, and about 83 well-organized criminal gangs have that today. And any, mediocre hacker can find it on the dark web for about 63 cents. Things that used to be secret aren't secret. Let's not keep fighting these last wars. So Carol talked a little bit before about FinCEN, and I think John Vanderplas from IDME made a reference to it as well. This was a slide, I think you actually presented this when you were in FinCEN. I screenshotted it from the Fed ID forum like 3 years ago, when FinCEN, under Carol's leadership, was first starting to talk about just how bad this is with identity-related cybercrime. It's a key contributor to trillions of cybercrime. And then more recently, 2 months ago, Jimmy Kirby, who's the deputy director of FinCEN, said, look, we looked at more than 3 million SARs, the suspicious activity reports that banks file each year. The vast majority include reference to some breakdown in the identity verification process, verification, impersonation, compromise. Getting to the point I made before, it's an anomaly when something bad happens in cyberspace and identity doesn't provide the attack vector. You're now starting to see this documented in terms of just how bad this is. And at least talking to FinCEN, I think they're going to start to share some more specific statistics. They've been doing work to really track this and break it down. And I think when the numbers emerge, and I hope that soon, you're going to see a lot of jaws drop in terms of what a national problem this is. Between what we saw in the benefits fraud, between what we're seeing in financial services, there's a lot of good money going to not very good people who it doesn't belong to. So why has this been so hard to solve? Well, I often talk about what I call the identity gap, which is that the U.S. has a number of nationally recognized authoritative identity systems: driver's license, passport, birth certificate, social security card. I got a global entry card. But every one of them is stuck in the paper world. And everything that we're trying to do today is increasingly digital. So, if you've ever had a question like this when applying for a credit card, well, this was an attempt to get around the identity gap. And like everybody kind of likes to crap on knowledge-based verification, and I've probably been guilty of that a time or two. But this exists for a reason, which is that companies and governments wanted to put stuff online. And because customers wanted to be able to get access to these things online, and everybody needed a solution to enable trusted digital commerce, and this was the best idea we had to close the identity gap. And look, it worked for a while. I think what we're seeing today is the attackers have caught up. And the out-of-wallet questions that might be the basis of these quizzes that you would get for knowledge-based verification aren't as secure as they used to be. And certainly not secret. And I mean, this is, people talk about the Equifax breach in 2017, which really raised a lot of the questions about what we're doing with remote identity proofing. But these were articles from 2015, when the IRS had a breach when they put an application online called Get Transcript. You could go on, answer a few questions, and then download your tax transcript for the previous year. And about 700,000 Americans had that data stolen because, as you can see circled at the bottom, the hackers already had the keys. These questions right now, a lot of the banks I do work with say if somebody answers a quiz too quickly or too accurately, it may be a sign of fraud, and that people might miss a question. They're going to take a while to think about, the answers to them. So this isn't unusual in cybersecurity. We have products, they're good for a while, and then the attackers get innovative and they catch up. But we are at a point now we need to start to think about things that are better. One of the things that I think has been leading to challenges in our knowledge-based approaches has been this epidemic of major breaches that we've had over the last 10 years. So the visualization on the right's from a site called Information is Beautiful that monitors basically big cyber incidents around the world and continues to update it year after year. And basically you can see the bigger the circle, the more records were compromised. 2014's at the bottom, 2022's at the top. You see around 2014 there's a lot of white space. You see the circles are smaller. There's not a lot of white space and a lot of big circles as you go higher. And so a point that was made in one of the first congressional hearings at the Equifax breach in the House Energy and Commerce Committee, I got to actually testify there on this topic of identity verification in the post-breach world. So Greg Walden, who was the chairman of the House Energy and Commerce Committee at the time, said, we've been looking at all of these breaches on their own, sort of individually, and we bring the CEOs and CISOs in and yell at them. And look, there's serious policy issues from any one breach, but what we're now seeing is the potential for malicious actors to combine multiple stolen data sets into one, which enables them to obtain more complete packages of identity information. Attackers are innovating. So here's where we are today. In an era where our transactions are increasingly digital, our authoritative identity systems are stuck in the paper world. Solutions that papered over that for a while, over that fact for a while helped, but the attackers have caught up. Anything that's a shared secret, your social security number, a password, it's not a secret anymore. It's going to be compromised. It probably already has been. This isn't all negative in terms of what industry is doing. There's a ton of great innovation that's out there that's developing better next generation identity solutions. We talked about passwordless authentication. I think the ID proofing tools that can scan and validate documents, match with a selfie is certainly an innovation that's helping in some places. But so much of this discussion around what we're going to do in identity has been ignoring the fact that government at the end of the day is the only nationally recognized authoritative issuer of identity. And by the way, that's federal, state, and local. That's not one entity. And so in this next phase of making identity better, the government's going to have some sort of a role to play. So in other words, the private sector can't solve identity alone. Doing so is going to require that we have some better access to the authoritative sources, the government data. Which, then sounds really spooky and a lot of bad things could go wrong. So a big question is, well, is there a way we could actually do it in a way that's good for security and privacy? So I want to talk just for a minute about Web3 and identity because we've been through an interesting evolution in this space. So 2015, just as I was leaving NIST, there were a lot of people who were emerging at Identity Conference who were saying self-sovereign identity is the future. And, okay, what does this mean? Self-sovereign, that's an interesting term. And, the basic idea at the time was government and corporations have too much control over identity. I'm going to have the power to declare who I am. Like, okay, that's interesting. A lot of this was sort of being driven by, folks who had a bit of an anarcho-libertarian bent to things. I think the challenge that they quickly ran into as they were developing some of these early ideas is they quickly heard from anybody who could be a customer of these solutions, say governments, banks, people who really need to know at a high level of assurance who you are, that they're not going to accept your declaration if it's not backed up by an authoritative source. So look, it'd be great if you just, want to assert that you're a Washington Wizards fan as, for identity, or you're into furries or whatever your thing is. It's cool. But for authoritative identity systems, which is really where these big challenges are, you're going to need to be able to tie to some government source. I think there was also an issue, the optics of it. So Kim Cameron, who really sadly passed a couple years ago, but worked at Microsoft for years, was like one of the sort of the godfather of thinking about digital identity. His 7 Laws of Digital Identity he published over 10 years ago still are really impactful today. Kim said something at a conference a couple years before he passed, I think it was 2018, and he said, we got to stop using this term self-sovereign identity. It sounds like a bunch of yahoos taken to the hills with guns looking to secede from the country. Self-sovereign's not really a good term. So can we talk about user-centric identity, decentralized identity? The optics of trying to secede from the country while you build an identity system, maybe that's not what we're going to actually be using to drive this stuff forward. So I think we're at an interesting point where things are maturing these days. Now we're talking about verifiable credentials that can put people in their control of their identity. I think people get government matters. I think there's room within that for non-government issuers. But they all ultimately need to be able to validate attributes from the authoritative government source. So for those who are a fan of The Graduate, where Dustin Hoffman is aimlessly wandering through life after graduating from college, sleeping with his family friends, much older mother, Anyways, it's pulled over at the pool party. He's trying to figure out what he should do, and somebody says, I got one word for you: plastics. Well, in 2022, for in the identity space, validated attributes are the new plastics. And I'd say, you know, somebody said before, there's 13 companies in this room that are all hoping to develop Web3 identity solutions. I think if there's a single point you should all take away today, it's that without some sort of way to tie back into the authoritative government sources and be able to at least validate the data there as you're creating some sort of a new credential, perhaps a derived credential that's tied to the authoritative government sources, none of this is going to really work, because you need to be able to go back to the issuer of identity. And so focusing on, you know, the idea of government opening up attribute validation services really, I think, needs to be central, not just to the Web3 community, but to anybody who wants to try and get more reliable digital identity solutions. And while it's great that we're all here talking about it today, I will tell you, when you look at the authoritative issuers, most of them don't care. They're not even beginning to think about this. So, you know, states are starting to do some things with mobile driver's license, which is really interesting. The vital records bureaus are starting to think about something digital, but I mean, it's really early stages. And by the way, they have no money. They have no ability to go do anything. State Department's not thinking about anything with passports. SSA, I'll talk about in a minute. We're making a little progress there. The key, once you have access to validated attributes, is how can you build systems that can enable people to assert their identity without having a credential tied to a third-party identity provider or requiring the issuer to have to be contacted by a relying party to validate the credential. People really worry about tracking in that. And there's ways you can do that with Web3, and there's ways you can do it with other architectures. But I think we're at least at a point where the discussion's maturing from where we were a few years ago, when it was people getting in my face that the government was never going to matter again, so occasionally I'm right about something. And, you know, we also seen some standards that are out here. We've talked a little bit today about W3C, both the verified credential standard and decentralized identifiers. There's also a great publication that OpenID Foundation put out this year looking at how the OpenID Connect standard can interact with verifiable credentials. Like, good, serious things are happening now. And if you're not familiar with what these documents are, I'd say go, you know, look into them a little bit more. So let me talk a little bit about the Better Identity Coalition. So we were launched in 2018 as an initiative of a nonprofit called the Center for Cybersecurity Policy and Law. Basically, we are the one group in town that has been focused on bringing leading companies together from different sectors to develop and advance, you know, what I would call consensus-driven policy solutions that can promote the development and adoption of better solutions for identity verification and authentication. Our members are an interesting bunch. You'll see about half of our firms are what I would call the big buyers, largely in financial services. So banks like Wells Fargo, US Bank, JP Morgan Chase, PNC, CVS Health is a big member on the healthcare side, AT&T is a mobile network operator, Fidelity, Mass Mutual, and then a lot of the vendors who are providing solutions to them, including LexisNexis and ID.me, who you just heard from. It's really been the one place where both the buyers and the providers are coming together to collaborate on these issues. And, you know, how we got started, I talked before about the Equifax breach. This was really what launched it, because everybody was freaking out about a couple things. One, there were 141 million Social Security numbers stolen, which kind of got people uncomfortable. And you know, there were some solutions that were some ideas that were being proposed in the wake of the headlines that sounded great. Let's replace the SSN with something new. Really? You're going to trade one number for another and then not change the, you know, anything underneath it? Or Patrick McHenry, who's a leading Republican in the House Financial Services Committee, said, in fact, he may be in line to chair it starting in January, hey, why don't we ban the credit bureaus from using the SSN? And my take was, boy, that sounds good in the wake of the headlines, but you want to crater the economy in 36 hours? Make it really hard for a bank who I'm applying for credit for to not know which of the 300 Jeremy Grants that there are in the country I am, because the SSN's really helpful there as an identifier to resolve, you know, who you're talking about. And then there was this broader discussion that I touched on earlier, which is, hey, Equifax is one of the dominant providers of remote identity proofing solutions. Can we trust them now that we've been breached? And so this led to a hearing where some of these ideas got a little bit of airtime in Energy and Commerce Committee right around this time 5 years ago. So, you know, part of what happened was, as these proposals were emerging, I was getting calls from a lot of companies concerned about some of these things, a lot of people in government concerned about some of these things, trying to figure out what to do. We finally got a bunch of people together in the room and talked about it, and the take was, everybody seems to want to do something here. Nobody actually has good ideas to know what to do. Why don't we form a new organization that could start to bring everybody together and figure this out. And we eventually published a policy blueprint in the summer of 2018 that says this is actually what the government needs to do if they really want to tackle this problem. It's basically 5 core areas where government can and should help. It's got a specific action plan saying who should do what within Congress and the executive branch. I think at the core of this is the idea there's no silver bullet here. There's no single action or initiative that's going to solve identity. But taken as a package, if the policy blueprint's enacted and funded, it'll make identity better. It'll get us a lot, much closer to a solution. And we really focused on 5 key initiatives. I'm going to focus quite a bit on the first one because I think it's most relevant to this crowd. But 1, we need to focus on acknowledging what we have for ID proofing and verification isn't good enough, and it needs to be a national priority to actually develop next generation solutions that can be better. Second, rethinking the way America uses the Social Security number, recognizing it's not one thing these days, it's 2. It's an identifier, which Jeremy Grant is me and which is the 6'8" power forward for the Portland Trailblazers who spells his name wrong. I need to come back as him in my next life. And also being used as an authenticator. Oh, if you tell me you're SSN, it must prove you're you. Well, if you actually realize SSNs don't have any security value, the use of it as an identifier becomes much more benign. We talked about promoting and prioritizing the use of strong authentication, because SSNs allows the authenticator and passwords don't work. International coordination and harmonization. This is an area we've had a really good partnership with Treasury and FinCEN the last few years, including being asked by them to help advise the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, a couple of years ago on the digital identity guidelines. And then finally, educating consumers and businesses about better identity, because if we get the first 4 done, that doesn't mean that people know what to do with it. So focusing on the first one, actually, let me talk about this. What does better look like? We spent a lot of time in the coalition as we were writing the policy blueprint thinking about it, and we really settled on 4 ideas. The first was better security with less fraud and identity theft, and this pointed back to a 2016 bipartisan commission on improving cybersecurity that basically said we should be eliminating compromises of identity as a major attack vector in cyberspace by 2021. So we're, not there yet. The second was better convenience for consumers. How can you open a new account online with ease without having to go through some duplicative, burdensome enrollment process, basically, recreating in a digital fashion the crappy process you went through the DMV a few years ago. Better confidence for both consumers and service providers that the solutions you're using online are reliable and trustworthy. And we said we need to have better privacy. How do we actually shift the model for identity verification from one that was based largely on firms without any sort of proactive opt-in consent, aggregating data, to one where you can proactively request that your identity be validated by a party with whom you already have a trusted relationship. So focusing on the first item, in simple terms, the idea that we put forward that I think has really sort of shifted the debate in Washington from, a lot of times when this discussion came up in the past, it was, well, why don't we do a national ID? And our point was, we don't need a national ID card. In fact, we've got too many cards these days. What we need are just, how do we leverage the existing solutions we have that are already out there without creating any new databases in government to come up with digital counterparts to the physical documents we have. So if I already went through that crappy process at the DMV to get my Real ID driver's license, and I'm trying to prove who I am online, can I just ask the DMV to vouch for me rather than try to have to go through a new solution? So America's legacy paper-based systems need to be modernized around a privacy-protecting, consumer-centric model that will allow a consumer to ask an agency that issued a credential to stand behind it in the online world by validating the information from that credential. So we've had some early progress here. I talked a little bit before about SSA. So while the coalition was writing its blueprint, the banks were getting really frustrated with synthetic identity fraud. Synthetic fraud is generally where you have what I would call a digital Frankenstein, where you'll take say a social security number belonging to, say, my 11-year-old, who probably isn't in any of the credit bureaus right now because he doesn't have any credit. He's good at stealing cash out of my wallet from time to time when he needs something, but that's all right. So you take a real SSN that the credit bureaus haven't seen, put a fake name on it and a fake date of birth, and then you run it through a credit application, and the first time it goes through, the credit bureau who it's sent to for validation will say, hey, we haven't seen this record, so we're going to reject it. But they'll put a little file in that says, hey, looks like, Joe Schmo with, this data was trying to apply for credit. Well, 3-4 months later, a criminal will then take that same identity, put them on as an approved biller on an existing credit card. Now that fake digital Frankenstein starts to build a credit history. A few months later, they can apply for credit on their own, build this up over years. The Federal Reserve says this is now a $20 billion a year problem with synthetic identity fraud. A lot of it was tied to the fact that there wasn't an easy way for firms like Lexus or the credit bureaus to get a simple yes-no answer when somebody's applying for credit. Is there really a Jeremy Grant with a date of birth and SSN who's not dead? A yes-no answer there, turns out, goes a long way to addressing this issue. And so the banks worked with Congress in 2018 to direct the Social Security Administration to basically set up an API that they could ping them just to get a yes-no answer. And it's really nice from a privacy perspective, and that SSA is not sharing any information. They're just saying, yeah, it matches, or no, it doesn't. So, sharing attributes, that opens up a lot of other security privacy risks. So we've been working with SSA to provide them industry feedback on standards, API design, best practices for electronic consent, fee structure. This is up and running right now. They are, I think, running about 1.5 million transactions a week through it, based on the conversation I had with them a couple days ago. It's an example. It's a much longer discussion. This could be a much better system and a much cheaper system, but it's an example of the sorts of things that I think we need to have more authoritative issuers of identity do. And then also we've been talking, and you'll be hearing from Bill Foster a little bit after lunch today, the Improving Digital Identity Act. So there's two different bills, HR 4258 and S 4528. It wasn't planned that they almost looked like the same number. It just randomly worked out that way. But it's a bipartisan bill on both the House and the Senate that was introduced to coordinate a government-wide approach to setting up more identity validation services, tying to different authoritative sources. So Congressman Foster has been the lead Democrat, along with John Katko, who's the lead Republican in the House Homeland Security Committee, who's sadly retiring, but has had a really good focus on the cybersecurity side of things. Two other sponsors, Jim Langevin and Barry Loudermilk, another Democrat and Republican. And the Senate side, we saw a counterpart introduced earlier this year by Kirsten Sinema and Cynthia Lummis. And basically, we're in a interesting spot right now. Let me talk about the bill a little bit, and then I'll talk about, sort of where it's at. So there's really three pillars to the bill. The first is calling for the White House to set up a task force that would take a whole of government approach, looking at the authoritative issuers at the federal, state, and local level, and having them all at the table, along with some different folks from the private sector, to come up with a comprehensive whole of government approach to how you could set up these sorts of digital counterparts to close this gap between physical and digital. And the idea there is that you really need a whole of government approach, because if SSA does it with an API, and the Vital Records Bureaus do it on the blockchain, and the DMVs do it with an app, and your PNC Bank or CVS Health or a government agency, you want to have a consistent set of standards and a consistent way to connect with these things. Otherwise, you won't really get the benefits of it. It just becomes a whole siloed hodgepodge of stuff. The second is because you need to have not just interoperability, but also security and privacy. It would task my old team at NIST with basically coming up with a playbook that any agency at any level of government could follow if they wanted to create identity verification services. And then it would also authorize grant dollars to the states to modernize their legacy systems to support digital ID. I mentioned before the Vital Records Bureaus really don't have resources. DMVs also have some real challenges on this side. And so we really think if we want to solve this quickly, you need to have an infusion of cash to the states. So you see there's a little asterisk above the middle pillar. We worked with Congressman Foster when the CHIPS and Science Act was being negotiated this summer to get that language included in the NIST reauthorization that was in that bill. So that's now law, and NIST now has direction to go and create this. The other two elements are what we're working on. I want to talk just about the Improving Digital Identity Task Force. It talks, I know we're a little bit short on time, so I don't want to read everything in here, other than to say one of the things the bill would require as the White House is considering things is what the role of distributed ledger technology could be within this approach. It doesn't call for DLT versus anything else, but it at least is listed in there as one of the things that should be considered. So here's where we're at with the bill. Mentioned the NIST provision we got passed this year. The bill was, with the remnant of that bill, minus the NIST stuff, was marked up in the House Oversight Committee back in July, and a revised House bill was introduced in the Senate that day. That same exact language became S 4528. That then got marked up September 28th in the Senate HISGAC, the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, but the grants got chopped out of it. The Republicans said we're not going to authorize any new grant programs. So it's really focused on the task force and at least getting this coordination process started. We think there's an opportunity to include the bill in the big year-end legislative package. That is the one vehicle that has to move before everybody gets out of town for Christmas. We're certainly working toward that right now. This is where we think we at least have a good chance to get things kicked off next year with formal congressional direction and authorization to the administration to actually make digital identity priority. Because despite the good work that Carol and a few other people have been doing, this is now the second administration in a row that really hasn't focused much on this at all. There really has been no coordinated national approach on this topic since the end of the Obama administration. So I just wanted to close why is it that government needs to act? As I've said before, it's the only authoritative issuer of identity, but that role is split between the federal, state, and local levels. And stuff's happening today. So it's not like we're not making progress in areas, but without a coordinated approach that involves all the different issuers, it's going to take another 15 years to try and get solutions to this problem. In the meantime, we'll see identity theft and ID-related cybercrime continue to thrive. I think we're going to see solutions that are going to roll out that aren't going to be standards-based, which is going to make them hard for a lot of people to use. And we'll miss an opportunity to say we're going to set a high bar in all of these solutions for security and privacy, making sure this is done right. So with that, hope you all can work with us.